Everything is being recorded. Okay, so I will start again now with the recording running. Welcome to CUA's History Virtual Colloquium. I am Dr. Julia Young. I'm a historian of Mexico, Latin America, and immigration here at the Catholic University of America. And I'm really delighted to welcome all of you. I see that we have students here and faculty from CUA and many off-campus participants, which is the wonderful thing about these Zoom events, is that we can invite people from anywhere. And I think we have people here from all over the country, as well as possibly one or two from Mexico. And so welcome and bienvenidos. Tonight we have a wonderful guest. We have Dr. Gema Kloppe-Santamaría, who will be giving us a talk entitled "In the Name of Christ, Lynching and Religion in Post-Revolutionary Mexico." And let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Kloppe-Santamaría's bio. She is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Loyola University, Chicago. Her research deals with questions of violence, security, religion, and gender in Latin America, with a particular focus on Mexico and Central America. Before joining Loyola, she was a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame University, and an assistant professor of international studies at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. She holds a PhD in sociology and historical studies from the New School for Social Research and a master's in gender and social policy from the London School of Economics. She is the author of In the Vortex of Violence, Lynching, Extralegal Justice, and the State in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, which came out in 2020 from the University of California Press. Her work has been featured in the Latin American Research Review, the Americas, and the Journal of Latin American Studies. And also she has authored reports for the United Nations Development Program, the Wilson Center for International Scholars here in DC, and the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center. In addition to her work on vigilante justice and state formation, Dr. Kloppe-Santamaría is currently working on a new project that deals with the contentious relationship between religion and violence in Mexico. So welcome, Dr. Kloppe-Santamaría, and thank you very much for being with us. And I'll let you get started.
Thank you. Thank you for this welcome and remarks. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I would like to begin by thanking Professor Julia Young for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you today, as well as to the Department of History at Catholic University of America. So my talk is based on a chapter of my recently published book, In the Vortex of Violence, Lynching, Extralegal Justice, and the State in Post-Revolutionary Mexico. In the Vortex of Violence examines the history of lynching during the formative decades of the post-revolutionary period from the 1930 to 1960. Through the examination of more than 300 cases of lynching, the book analyzes the impact that Mexico's process of state formation, together with religion, perceptions of crime, and mythical beliefs, had in the organization and legitimation of this practice. Today, I would like to focus my presentation on the impact that religion had in the organization and legitimation of lynching. Before I begin, let me refer briefly to the definition of lynching that informs my work. I define lynching as a collective, public, and particularly cruel form of violence aimed at punishing behaviors considered threatening or deviant by members of a given community. In the Latin American context, a lynching may or may not end in the victim's death, but it always involves an unusually brutal and visible use of violence. Far from being purely impulsive or irrational, lynchings constitute significant political acts that are grounded in long-term state-society relations as well as intra-community conflicts. In post-revolutionary Mexico in particular, lynchings were not an expression of state absence or state failure. Instead, lynchings signaled people's reaction to the presence of state authorities that were perceived as abusive, arbitrary, and illegitimate. Lynchings were also a reflection of the ways in which state and non-state actors alike resorted to extra-legal forms of violence as a tool of social control. Although they were not primarily informed by race and by racial tensions, as is the case in the history of lynching in the United States, lynchings are and continue to be in contemporary Latin America a means to exclude people and behaviors that threaten the status quo, as well as the moral, political, and religious integrity of given communities. And so victims of lynching include suspected criminals, socialists, communists, public officials, people accused of witchcraft, as well as other religious minorities. So let me begin. On November of 1934, dozens of villagers lynched widow Micaela Ortega in the town of Acajete in Puebla. Micaela was known for being a spiritist healer, a socialist, and a fervent anti-clerical. According to an official investigation, days before her lynching, Micaela had threatened neighbors with turning the town's church into a library, as well as with burning the image of Jesus the Father. The autopsy revealed perpetrators used conspicuous cruelty against Micaela. Dressed in a white dress with red flowers and a necklace made of coral, her body showed clear signs of torture. Her face presented several bruises and cuts made close to her ears with knives and machetes. Her thorax had been worn with pieces of hot iron, and her left leg had been broken with clubs. In their testimony, Micaela's children recounted that just minutes before the lynching, they heard the town's church bells ringing, as well as people shouting, "Long live Christ the King." Micaela's daughter, who was also assailed that night, stated that amongst those that participated in the lynching was the town's mayor, a Catholic militant who had participated in the Cristero War, Mexico's conflict over the religious question that took place from 1926 to 1929. Despite its overt cruelty, the lynching of Micaela Ortega was not isolated. From 1934 to 1938, approximately 100 socialist teachers were hanged, mutilated, and tortured across different towns of central and southern Mexico. Perpetrated by armed groups of vigilantes, as well as by lynch mobs, attacks against socialist teachers constituted a reaction to the anti-clerical and pro-agrarian undertones of the government's campaign to secularize and modernize the countryside through public schooling. Conversely, during the 1940s and up to the 1950s, dozens of Protestants were expelled from their communities, had their homes and churches burned, and were either threatened or actually lynched by groups of Catholics in different states of Mexico. In addition to violence perpetrated against socialist teachers and Protestants, throughout these decades, rioters and lynch mobs attacked dozens of individuals accused of desecrating Catholic churches and religious symbols in several cities and towns. Victims included people who were allegedly caught stealing religious images, as well as heretic men and women who defiled the sacredness of churches or the authority of local priests. Taken together, these three expressions of violence that I just mentioned, the lynching of impious individuals accused of desecrating religious spaces, collective attacks against socialist teachers, and assaults against Protestants, allow us to illuminate the central place that religion, and specifically Catholic religion, had in shaping the legitimacy and occurrence of lynching during this period. They bring to the fore three dimensions of the religious experience that contributed to the collectivization of violence, namely the defense of religious symbols by laymen and clergy in light of the anti-clerical and anti-religious policies promoted by the Mexican state, Catholics' promotion of a conservative and reactionary ideology that rejected the influence of so-called foreign religious creeds and progressive ideologies, and the role of parish priests in sanctioning or tolerating the use of violence as a means to defend the moral and spiritual integrity of communities. So in the following minutes, I will discuss each of these three expressions and examine the different ways in which religion, understood as a field that involved both otherworldly and mundane questions, including political and economic interests, added to the collectivization of violence in post-revolutionary Mexico. So I will now discuss those attacks against impious or blasphemous individuals. On June of 1931, a group of worshippers lynched Leon Muste outside of a small church located in a town in Michoacan. Muste, a Dutch national, had ignited the sentiments of churchgoers when he started shouting offenses against Catholic religion and in defense of communism. The worshippers, who were praying inside the church, asked Muste to stop his anti-religious diatribe. The town's priest joined his congregation and reprimanded the man for his provocative actions. Instead of discontinuing his incendiary speech, Muste threatened the priest with what appeared to be a gun. In that moment, a crowd of worshippers, including a group of young devoted women, surrounded Muste and started beating him severely. The man died in the hands of the lynch mob before the police could intervene. The lynching of Muste in a town located in Michoacán, one of the hotbeds of the Cristero War, illustrates the violent reactions that impious individuals could provoke amongst Catholic devotees. Although press accounts could make these and similar incidents seem sudden and irrational, an analysis of several cases taking place under similar circumstances allows us to situate their occurrence within a context characterized by revolutionary anti-clericalism and by Catholics' fierce defense of their religious beliefs and practices. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, hundreds of churches were closed down, occupied, damaged, or destroyed by government officials as part of the defanatization and secularization campaigns promoted by post-revolutionary elites. These anti-clerical measures sought to undermine the influence exercised by the Catholic Church and establish a new civil religion based on reason, individual autonomy, and socialist values. Some post-revolutionary leaders incorporated the adoption of iconoclast actions as part of their mission to defanaticize. By burning and destroying religious symbols and desecrating churches, these leaders not only sought to assault the political and economic power of religion, but also to undermine religious symbolic structure. The enduring authority of the Catholic Church in Mexico, together with the centrality that religious images and spaces had for Catholics' experience of the sacred, meant that these policies faced substantial resistance. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, fears and rumors regarding the potential expulsion of priests, the closing down of churches, and the robbery or destruction of religious images prompted riots, lynchings, and other forms of collective violence. Certainly, not all of those who engaged in acts of blasphemy were anti-clerical ideologues. People accused of stealing religious images in particular sometimes acted more like small-time thieves rather than anti-clerical revolutionaries. For instance, in contrast to Muste, whose verbal attack on religion was informed by communist ideas, the motivations of Fructuoso Concha, a man who stole several religious images from a church located in Tlaxcala, was economic in nature. Concha had stolen some religious objects made of gold and precious stones. After being taken to the penitentiary, a mob broke into the building, dragged him out, and lynched him. On the morning after the incident, the town's church bells were rung in order to announce villagers that justice had been served. When they woke out of their homes, people saw Concha's corpse hanging from a tree in the middle of the town's plaza. Newspapers and public officials presented religiously motivated lynchings as the result of a master plan orchestrated by the higher ranks of the Catholic Church. However, the influence of the clergy in the organization of lynching was more nuanced and certainly not part of a top-down strategy. Although the antagonistic position promoted by bishops provided an important source to legitimate the use of violence in the name of religion, the influence of the church was most clearly manifested in the behavior of local priests who adopted a belligerent stance against the government's anti-clerical policies. Parish priests were considered a central source of local authority, and their presence was regarded as an essential component of the spiritual well-being of communities. The religious authority, particularly in small towns, oftentimes blended with politics, as priests developed a close relation with political and economic elites. Priest influence did not escape rural teachers' attention, who time and again complained about the priest's ability to agitate worshippers. So during the next section of my talk, I will consider these factors in the context of the explosive responses to socialist education that were articulated in several communities in Mexico. So I'm going to talk now about lynchings against socialist teachers. On July of 1934, the Mexican government announced the beginning of a new era of the revolution. It spelled an era in which revolutionary ideas would enter the consciousness of children and youth in order to fight the detrimental influence of conservative and clerical elements. The main battlefield for this new front of radical transformation would be public education, which from now on would be socialist in orientation and content. To the Catholic Church, the dangers presented by this new model of education were evident. The socialist education was informed by an overt anti-clerical and anti-religious ideology and involved the state's interference in a realm that the Church considered central for the promotion of its religious doctrine. As a policy that sought to promote the agrarian reform within rural communities, socialist education threatened not only the right of parents to provide a religious education to their children, but also the natural right to private property, or what Catholics saw as a natural right of private property. Equally problematic in the eyes of Catholics was the role that socialist teachers play in the defanatization campaigns promoted by the government. Teachers petitioned for the removal and expulsion of priests, contributed to the closing down of churches, as well as to the organization of patriotic festivals meant to eclipse religious celebrations. Although teachers did not homogeneously embrace radical forms of anti-clericalism, their image as official representatives of an anti-clerical state, together with the iconoclastic actions of a few Jacobin teachers, made them vulnerable to the hostility of Catholic mobs. Acts of iconoclasm left a particularly deep impression amongst Catholics who witnessed teachers and their young pupils destroy crosses, set images of the Virgin on fire, mutilate images of patron saints, and vandalize churches. In San Juan de Gracia, Michoacán, for instance, a local reported that the church was vandalized with damages including a Christ without head and the body of the local patron saint, Saint San Jose, with only 1 foot left. In several cases, such impious acts carry great consequences. In the northern state of Durango, for instance, 2 teachers who asked their students to deny the existence of God and to make other heretical pronouncements in the classroom were found dead in the town's main plaza. The female teacher had asked their students to greet her by saying, "There is no God," while the male teacher told students that he, and I quote, urinated in God. Sometime later, she was found naked, raped, and with her breast mutilated. The male teacher was found castrated. On his body, the perpetrators left a note that in poor spelling said, "So you do not go around peeing on God." Catholic mobs and groups of vigilantes responded to teachers' defilement of religious symbols and practices, not only by threatening them with violence or by physically assaulting them, but also, as these cases show, by mutilating and marking their bodies. On November of 1935, for instance, 3 teachers were killed in different towns of Puebla by a group of vigilantes. One of the teachers had his head practically dismembered with a machete blow. The other 2 were shot and their bodies left outside of the school where they imparted socialist education. The mutilation of ears was salient amongst the forms of violence used against teachers, as were hangings and to a lesser extent, burnings. At a symbolic level, the cutting off of ears can be interpreted as a way to denounce the government's deafness towards those that oppose socialist education, as well as a means to mark teachers' bodies in order to send a message to a broader audience. For instance, a picture of 2 female teachers published in 1935 by national newspaper Excelsior show 2 teachers wearing heavy bandages around their heads. This image sent a powerful message to others regarding the potential costs or the potential consequences that imparting socialist education could have. Violence against socialist teachers declined considerably after 1938. The resistance that socialist education encountered at the local level contributed to the government's decision to moderate its anti-religious and anti-clerical aspects. The following years would witness a significant shift in the relationship between state and church. Particularly during the 1940s, the state's relationship to the Catholic Church would not only become less antagonistic, but would in fact become increasingly harmonious, even collaborative. However, this detente did not put an end to lynchings driven by Catholic religion. Although lynchings against teachers declined, Protestants would become the target of attacks organized in the name of religion, morality, and the nation. So now I turn to the third manifestation of violence, which is lynchings against Protestants. In April of 1944, in a small town in Puebla, a crowd of approximately 50 people assailed a group of evangelical worshippers armed with clubs, stones, and pistols. Shouting "Death to the Protestants," the crowd injured several worshippers who were next taken to the municipal hospital. Reporting on the incident, a newspaper described that days before the attack, a group of Sinarquistas, members of the Sinarquist National Union, a right-wing, conservative, and anti-communist religious organization, had visited the town and asked the priest to bless a national flag they were carrying as a banner. The following month, in several towns of the states of Puebla and Veracruz, a group of Catholics burned down the houses of 12 evangelical families. The attack was perpetrated in retaliation for the iconoclasm of evangelicals who, after burying a member of their congregation, destroyed the crosses of the municipal cemetery. On November of the same year, a group of Catholics burned down the houses of 9 evangelical families and blew up their temple, after learning evangelicals were planning on introducing more pastors into the town. The attack led to the exodus of 70 families. From 1944 to the end of the 1950s, dozens of Protestants fell victim to Catholic rioters and lynch mobs in different states of central and southern Mexico. And I should say, and I can talk about this more, but attacks against Protestants continue throughout the rest of the 20th century and continue up till this day. Echoing the dynamics of violence against socialist teachers during the 1930s, attacks against Protestants were perpetrated by both spontaneous mobs as well as by armed groups of vigilantes, in this case, members of the Sinarquist National Union. Attacks against Protestants, together with the seeming impunity that followed them, need to be understood against the backdrop of the conservative politics brought about by President Manuel Ávila Camacho, who began his term in the second half of the 1940s. From the moment he was elected president, Ávila Camacho made clear that the days of anti-clericalism and state-sponsored socialism were over. He openly expressed his Catholic faith and eliminated the constitutional clause that characterized the content of Mexico's public education as socialist. The new president also distanced himself from the progressive politics promoted in the 1930s, including including the agrarian reform and the socialist education, and instead he promoted an anti-communist, nationalist, and conservative ideology. The Catholic Church also changed during these years. From the mid-1930s onwards, the higher ranks of the clergy openly decried those that sought to defend religion through the use of arms. This shift would become even more acute during the 1940s as the battle against communism and the defense of the motherland against foreign influences provided new common ground for the Mexican state and the church to create alliances. In addition to the battle against communism, the church engaged in a parallel struggle against Protestantism. On his pastoral letter of October of 1944, Archbishop Luis Maria Martinez launched a crusade in defense of Catholic faith and against, and I quote, the infernal serpent of Protestantism. In the letter, he expressed that through the resources and propaganda, Protestant sects intended to take away, and I quote, Mexicans' most valuable treasure, the Catholic faith that 4 centuries ago was brought to us by the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe. This so-called crusade singled out both Protestantism and communism as foreign and dangerous ideologies that needed to be eliminated to secure the moral integrity of Catholic communities, all while reiterating Catholicism as the only authentic national religion. Representative of the verbal attacks against Protestants enabled by this crusade, a document that circulated at the time read, and I quote, "Let the most vile of deaths fall upon them, upon Protestants, and let them descend alive into the abyss. Let their burial be with wolves and asses. Let voracious dogs devour their cadavers. Let the devil and its angels be their perpetual companions. Amen, amen. In time, this type of discursive incitements to violence would become actualized at the local level through lynchings and collective attacks against Protestants. Catholics took into their own hands Archbishop Luis Maria Martinez's call to repel Protestants and their dangerous propaganda. On December of 1944, for instance, a crowd assailed a group of Lutherans who were distributing flyers with information about the religious doctrine in a town in the state of Guanajuato. In addition to destroying the religious leaflets, the crowd attempted to lynch a member of their congregation. Similarly, on May of 1945, in the neighborhood of Coyoacán in Mexico City, 3 young men were threatened by a group of Catholic men and women in the neighborhood's main plaza. The young men were distributing leaflets and posting some posters in the street, which urged the Mexican people to renounce Catholic religion. As these cases make clear, Catholics consider Protestant dissemination of the religious beliefs offensive and potentially threatening. Although Catholicism continued to be Mexico's dominant religion during this time, the marginal increase of non-Catholic faiths, together with the church official discourse regarding the increasing presence of Protestants in the country, heightened Catholics' animosities towards this religious minority. More so, Protestants had historically sided with political ideologies that were condemned by Catholicism, such as liberalism and socialism, both of which encouraged social change, the emancipation of the individual, as well as the elimination of the Catholic Church corporate privileges. During this period in particular, Protestants supported socialist education and sympathized with the agrarian reform. They also approved of the state sanitation and anti-alcohol campaigns, which echo Protestants' pursuit of moral regeneration. Equally important, Protestants refused to participate in Catholic festivals and rituals that were contrary to their beliefs. Protestants' refusal to participate in such festivities was not only seen as an affront to Catholics' exercise of religion, but was also perceived as a source of danger for the unity and stability of these communities. Although not all of these attacks resulted in lynchings, their occurrence illuminates the climate of hostility that Protestants experienced during these years. Emulating the religious persecution that they had themselves endured during previous decades at the hands of anti-clerical revolutionaries, Catholics intimidated and harassed Protestant ministers. They also directed their attacks against entire families of Protestant believers, breaking into their temples, vandalizing their houses, and forcing them into exodus. And I should say here that with Protestants, I'm including evangelicals, Mormons, and all other denominations. So I should use the plural to refer to them. Proclaiming their rights as Mexican citizens, Protestants asked federal authorities to intervene in order to protect their lives and guarantee their right to exercise religion. As socialist teachers did before them, Protestants denounced local authorities for their incapacity or unwillingness to secure their lives and provide them with justice. Despite the various letters and telegrams sent to the office of the president and to the Minister of the Interior, the central government neither condemned these attacks publicly, nor did it provide an effective protection to these citizens. The Catholic Church was equally silent about violence against Protestants. Hence, both civil and religious authorities implicitly tolerated the actions perpetrated and contributing then to their impunity. Protestants tried to resist the narrative that claimed the religion was a symbol of foreign influence by reminding the government that it was Catholics who had tried to undermine both the country's independence and the revolutionary project by aligning themselves with reactionary forces. Similar to teachers, Protestants appealed to the values of the revolution and urged authorities to live up to the promise of religious tolerance and secularism promoted by revolutionary elites. Their efforts, however, would prove futile. The new ideological proximity between the Catholic Church and the post-revolutionary state, grounded on issues of nationalism and anti-communism, meant that violence against Protestants would go unpunished. So with these three expressions of violence, let me now turn to my concluding remarks. In this talk, I have examined the impact that Catholic religion had in the organization and legitimation of lynching in post-revolutionary Mexico. Through the analysis of several cases of lynching perpetrated against iconoclast individuals, socialist teachers, and Protestant believers, I have brought to the fore the ways in which religious beliefs and practices contributed to render lynching as a legitimate means to punish individuals perceived as threatening for the spiritual and political integrity of Catholic groups and communities. In order to understand how could lynchings be justified in the name of religion, this particularly cruel form of violence, it is necessary to underscore the ways in which the exercise of religion in post-revolutionary Mexico was shaped by both spiritual and material concerns. The rejection of the agrarian reform and the defense of parents' right to decide over the education of their children were predicated on religious and moral considerations that were, nonetheless, deeply intertwined with material and political interest. By the same token, resistance towards the presence of political ideologies or religious beliefs considered foreign or disruptive, including socialism and Protestantism, was informed by attempts to safeguard the moral integrity of Catholic communities, as well as to maintain the economic and political status quo. Even the belligerent defense of religious images and spaces was as much driven by people's beliefs in their sacredness as it was motivated by the political antagonism that the state's anti-clerical measures had provoked amongst Catholics during the first decades of the 20th century. The intertwinement of worldly and otherworldly concerns play a crucial role in the collectivization of violence against the impious. Equally important was the influence of the higher and lower ranks of the Catholic Church, through the promotion of a confrontational discourse that called upon the defense of Catholic values and traditions, from questions of land tenure to education, conservative politics, and the observance of religious rituals and festivals. Catholic authorities contributed shaping the contentious politics informing laymen and women. The cases I have discussed here span across 3 decades that signal very distinct moments in the history of church-state relationships. Whereas the 1930s was, for the most part, characterized by recurrent frictions between state and church, the 1940s and 1950s represented the pinnacle of the closer, even collaborative relation that emerged between the upper ranks of the Catholic hierarchy and post-revolutionary leaders. The persistence of lynching throughout these years demonstrates that the detente reached between state and church did not prevent the occurrence of lynching driven by Catholic religion. That religiously motivated lynchings continue even after the church officially abandoned its antagonistic stance towards the post-revolutionary state, and vice versa, brings to the fore the importance of understanding Catholic practices and beliefs beyond the realm of church-state relationships. It further illuminates the need to understand how Catholics on the ground reappropriated religious discourses and mandates in order to justify their use of violence in the name of Christ. Thank you. And I am, of course, more than happy to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you, Gema. You can't hear us, but I think we're all clapping for you.
Thank you.
That was wonderful and so clear. And there are some virtual claps coming. I see some questions already coming into the Q&A, but I'm gonna do my chair's priority and just start with I don't have a formal commentary, but just after listening to this, I have a few things that occur to me that I'd like to present to you, either to answer or just we can continue to talk about it. But this is so fascinating to me, and as some of you on this call know, I work in this area myself, and so find it endlessly fascinating. And yet I find Gema's work particularly so because it's really a new, looking at Catholic violence is somehow a new take on this topic. My sense, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Catholic violence in Mexico is very much it's a story that's been undertold. And I think it's been undertold both in Mexico itself and in the United States, and in the English language historiography. I have theories about why that is, and I'd love to talk about those with you. I mean, one is that so much of the literature that emerged from the church-state conflict in Mexico was produced by Catholics and highlights Catholic martyrdom, right? And that is what was conveyed to the audience, Catholic audiences, especially in the United States, both at the time and afterwards. I mean, the way that a lot of people have come to hear about the Cristero War in the US is through the beatification of the saints, the Cristero martyrs. And then, more recently from oh my goodness, the movie that For Greater Glory, right? That brought that to a larger audience and really, I think, focused more on martyrdom than Catholic violence. So I'm wondering about, what you think about that, and why has that narrative of Catholic martyrdom as opposed to Catholic antagonism or Catholic violence emerged or persisted. Another little question, but it's also a big question, is on terminology, and I struggle with this myself. But when we talk about Catholic violence, except in your third case where you're talking about Catholics versus Protestants, most of the time we're talking in Mexico about Catholics versus Catholics, right? But then there are these different kinds of Catholics. So have you found any answer to the sort of the terminology of all this? I have often used Cristero partisans, but that's talking about the Cristero period. And so, how do we talk about Catholic violence? Yeah, maybe you have more thoughts on that terminology. And then finally, it's your point about violence against, or your third section in your talk about violence against Protestants is really interesting, because I happened to receive an email related to asylum cases for an organization I volunteer for, asking for information about violence against Protestants today in order to bolster an asylum case of a woman. I believe she had left southern Mexico, and Evan's on this call, and he had consulted he had helped me respond to that email. But I'm just wondering if back then, so now Protestants who experience violence in Mexico, presumably at the hands of Catholics or on the basis of their religion, can appeal to the United States for asylum, right? On the grounds of religious, being targeted for their religion. Was there anything like that in this earlier period? Did Protestants appeal to the United States? I mean, you said already that they just didn't get a response from either the church or the state in Mexico. Did they appeal to their headquarters, or I'm not using the right term, but if their church was, if their home church was in the United States, did they appeal? Do you know anything about that? I'm just curious and wondering about, because to me, it seems like there are really such connections to today. So I'll leave it at that. And let me just reiterate that others can, I see already 3 questions in the chat. Others can go ahead and continue to add questions to the chat. And you can also use the raise hand feature if you want, and I'll test my multitasking abilities and try to answer. So Gema, I'll let you decide if you want to take on this or if you want to begin with other questions.
I'll be happy to respond to your questions, Julia, which were very rich, and indeed, like I feel that, like our work is clearly connected, and there are so many things also that I want to learn more about the Unión Nacional Sinarquista, and how they were or not involved in violence. So beginning with I agree with your assessment in terms of I think particularly literature that has been published in English. I'll return to that, but I don't think that's the case for literature published in Spanish. But I think literature published in English indeed has centered more on Catholic martyrdom, and on this more traditional understanding of martyrdom, where Catholics were those that were victimized by anti-clericalism and that were forced into exodus. And I think that's, part of the reason has to do with, like the importance that, or the attention that these forms of anti-Catholic violence received in the United States, the richness of the historiography, and also like in popular culture, no, as you said, like with films, novels, no, novels that were originally written in English as well. And so I think that's one of the explanations for that. A related question is that most of the literature, and this goes for literature in Spanish and in English, has, for the most part, focused on the Cristero War, or analyze violence and religious violence under the lenses of that conflict. And somehow, even though like there is certainly a very rich historiography that, you know, has brought into question that there was anything like a stable church-state relationship beginning in the 1940s, and has complicated that story. At the same time, I feel that all the discussion about violence gets subsumed under the Cristero War. No, I mean, it's so strong, like the historiography on that period, that then all these other incidents of violence, including the Second Cristiada, no, I mean, this following uprising that happened in the 1930s, gets somehow overshadowed, no, I mean, by this amount of wonderful scholarship that has dealt with the conflict, no, I mean, but that again is not necessarily centered, or doesn't make violence its central category of analysis, but rather war, no, I mean, and why this decision of take up arms. What I study, I mean, through the lenses of lynching, rioting, and other forms of extralegal justice, is more these disorganized forms of violence, no, I mean, that do not fall into this kind of like strictly speaking, like traditional conflict, no, I mean, and that I believe offers a very different window to understand Catholics' enactment of violence, no, and it opens up this other view, like more from the bottom, I would say, or from the margins. Now, again, I think in the Spanish literature, I mean, or rather literature published in Spanish on the subject, there is a lot of references to the kind of like religious intolerance and, you know, also like fanaticism of Catholics. But many of these, or a lot of this historiography, have up until recently been mostly written or put forward by people that sympathize with the revolution, no, like by this kind of like official historiography. And so again, it tended to caricaturize Catholics' use of violence, no, I mean, as an expression of fanaticism, of backwardness, of ignorance, and as if, you know, Catholics were entirely manipulated by parish priests and by the mandates of Catholic authorities, as if they had no agency, no, I mean, in terms of what they were deciding to do, or denying the very intricate connections between religion and political and material interest, no, I mean, so it has only been recently that several historians have begun to think about religion seriously, no, I mean, and think that it was not simply the manipulation of priests, it was not simply the manipulation of some, you know, economic elites that were fooling these peasants in order to attack socialist teachers, but that there were people that indeed felt offended by the anti-clericalism and even iconoclast actions of some of these teachers. Now, the question about you know, Catholics and the attacks against Catholics, and how do we call that? So what I would say is that for the most part, for the perpetrators of these acts, they were not attacking Catholics. Even though these people, I mean, might have identified as Catholics, I mean, for perpetrators, they were not Catholics. I mean, they were not Catholics because they were either, you know, like stealing religious images, they were promoting socialist education, they were practicing things that were against their Catholicism, no? I mean, and so here there is a question of like, who gets to say who is the right Catholic, no? And again, like I feel, I mean, I think that in all the study of lynching, what you encounter is that perpetrators, through the enactment of lynching, they are also asserting themselves as the legitimate representatives of their communities. So they are saying, we are Catholics, and we are a particular strand of Catholicism that is nationalist, that is offended by the presence of foreign or external elements, no, and that will you know, like use violence if necessary, no, I mean, so my response would be again that they do not see them as Catholics. They are others, no, I mean, they are deviant. Now, in terms of anti-Protestantism today, and your question about is if there were any efforts on behalf of Protestants to reach out to the United States or to, indeed, I mean, that's a story that that needs to be that needs to be told. But some of the leaders, for instance, of the evangelical of the organization to defend the rights of evangelicals. No, I mean, one of the organizations that that were sending telegrams and letters constantly to the president, to federal authorities. Some of the main leaders were actually former immigrants that had been in the United States and then came back to Mexico and became quite active and quite vocal, and that retained those transnational networks. Now, I haven't traced that story, but I'm sure it's there. No? I mean, because many of them were former immigrants, and so I'm sure there is something to be said there in terms of their advocacy.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and that actually leads into or links to the first question I wanted to read from the chat, which is from Ricardo Alvarez Pimentel. Hi. So question for Gema: did Ávila Camacho ever officially reverse course with regard to the Cárdenas administration's support of U.S. Protestant missionaries in Mexico?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, I don't think officially he did. I mean, this not to my knowledge, but there was definitely less support or less empathy for this for revolutionary support of the presence of Protestants at the local level. No, I mean, or revolutionaries' implicit support to diversify religion and have these other groups that supported many of the post-revolutionary projects, no, including secular education, socialist education, and agrarian reform. So again, officially not to my knowledge, but surely the administration of Ávila Camacho did have a very different stance towards Catholicism and other religious minorities.
There's a great book on this for anyone who's interested, and is it Gaston Espinosa? Gaspar Espinosa, and it's called Latino. It's just called Latino Protestants in the United States, I think. But at the beginning, he talks about those early 20th century, exactly what you mentioned, Gema, the converts in the United States, especially coming out of Los Angeles. It's there was the Asena Street revival, or somebody knows this. That's not me, but anyway, and how they went back to Mexico and then really like seeded those connections. So there's definitely more out there to read on this. So you have a question that's maybe a quick one. The next one from Connie Marquez. Thank you for your presentation. Could you please talk about the movie Canoa, where another lynching case in 1968 is depicted? I have not seen it. Have you seen it?
Yes, I have many times, and I have actually I wrote a chapter for a book edited by Michael Pfeiffer on the global history, or rather like the kind of comparative cases of lynching in the United States and beyond. And the chapter that I wrote for that book is based on my research on that case in particular, and actually comparing that case in 1968 with the cases against socialist teachers. So for people that are not familiarized with this case, I mean, this happened in a small town in Puebla, and it was a lynching against 5 university workers from Puebla University that were wrongly accused of being communist students. And the attack was instigated by the parish priest, by the local priest, who happened to support the PRI, the hegemonic political party. And these, again, like these were not communist students, they were university workers that were just camping in the town, and they were planning on going to a nearby mountain to explore, but the rumor was very strong, and in the context of anti-communist sentiments in the 1960s, the rumor spread like wildfire. I actually interviewed one of the survivors of this event, which the only one that is alive. 2 of them survived the attack. He survived with he had his hand mutilated, and it's fascinating. I mean, the only thing I would say about this movie, so a movie was done. I mean, this is one of the cases that is best known in the history of lynching in Mexico. And the movie that was filmed by Felipe Casals and became very popular, what I would say is that it does a good job in terms of portraying like this kind of like a state of panic and the kind of distrust that or kind of opposing attitudes that people had vis-a-vis students, and especially like communist students. But at the same time, it somehow, I think it flattens the way in which it portrays like Catholic mobs as these like, again, ignorant masses. No, and it doesn't provide enough nuance in terms of the internal conflicts within the community. I mean, how this kind of religious fervor was also informed by political divides. No, I mean, not everyone within Canoa was supportive of anti-communism. There were people in Canoa that were communists too. No, so it somehow portrays this community as being homogeneous, and that's not the case. No, I mean, there were like internal conflicts. So that's the one thing I would say about that. But I have watched many times that film. I would recommend it highly. And also one last thing, like the performance or the sequencing of the lynching, which begins with the tolling of the church bells or the ringing of the church bells, people carrying torches, circling around the victims. That's accurate. I mean, I have read the security reports of that case. I mean, I also interviewed the survivor, and that's how it happened. And it's interesting because it resonates with the ways in which, with the sequencing of lynchings during the period that I study, and with the sequencing that we observe, or the performance that we observe of lynching even today in Mexico. No, I mean, where the ringing of church bells has an importance that in practical terms has to do with being able to congregate people in a quick way. But I would say at the symbolic level, independently of those lynchings being or not related to religious questions, it kind of adds to the communal dimension of lynching, no? Or it kind of contributes to infuse these acts with a sense of that this is communal justice. No, this is not just some private vigilantism, but this is communal justice. So thank you, Connie.
I think that's yeah, that's a really good caution against romanticizing the sound of church bells in a beautiful Mexican town. You know, like they can have an ominous meaning as well. And I just want to say about movies that your comments about Canoa sound like my comments about For Greater Glory, which is that, you know, when there's a movie, I mean, which I think was a far inferior movie in a lot of ways, but when there's a movie on your specialty and you're a historian, you're just shaking your fist and saying how it's so much more complicated than that. And, you know, they should have consulted more historians, but probably if they did that, movies would maybe not be as complicated. Movies might be a little less exciting. So Nathan has a comment and a question. Wonderful presentation. And can you tell us more about your source base? And I would love to know that too.
Right. So about my sources, right? That's the question all historians want to know. So now this is a very good question. So I shall begin by saying that so lynching is not typified as a crime in Mexico. It doesn't have legal specificity, and therefore the judicial archives were of little help. I mean, I did find a few cases. I mean, because of levels of impunity in Mexico, which, you know, as you know, up till this day, like about 93% of crimes go unpunished. I mean, and that applies also for lynchings. So due to impunity and due to the fact that, again, lynching is not typified as a crime, the very few cases that were prosecuted were so under a different typology, either as tumultuous homicide. I mean, that's the closest to, not all tumultuous homicides were lynching, but the ones that were under that category. And in some cases also as seditious activities. Some of them are described as seditious activities. In the few cases that were prosecuted, most of them involve federal officials, especially military, no? That the investigation made it to the Supreme Court of Justice. So I have a few cases from the Supreme Court of Justice. But given that, the vast majority of my sources are, one, press, both mainstream newspapers as well as more crime news, Nota Roja. which interestingly enough have a very similar treatment of lynchings. I mean, you would think that the mainstream newspapers would be more critical of lynching and perhaps Nota Roja a little bit more lenient to it. And what I found is that they are very similar in the way they treat lynchings. They, for the most part, supported this practice, with the exception of cases that involve that were driven by religion. I mean, when they were driven by religion, many of these newspapers again portrayed lynching as a expression of fanaticism or ignorance. So newspapers, letters and telegrams written by families of victims of lynching, the letters that were written to the president, to state governors or to other federal authorities asking for justice, asking for the state to intervene, denouncing the complicity of majors and judges in the organization of these killings. And then security reports that were these within the Dirección General de Investigaciones Sociales, Políticas y Sociales, the Direction for Social Investigations. I'm not sort of translating that well, but
it's like the Mexican FBI. I mean, we could compare it to the FBI, right?
Right. Exactly. And they were like basically like, you know, like investigators. I mean, like, for instance, in the case of the lynching of Micaela Ortega, the one I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, my account is based for the most part on that security report. You know? I mean, where he goes, and they are very rich documents because, of course, I mean, they are biased. I mean, they were written for a very specific audience, for the federal authorities. But at the same time, many of the security reports, I mean, the agents were almost like ethnographers. So they were like describing like the town, I mean, the conflicts that existed between some people and other. They talk about the rumors. So again, in the case of Micaela Ortega, like he interviews her two children that witnessed the lynching. He interviews also the priest, no, who I mean, again, it's like very interesting what he says about the account. I mean, he denies knowing anything about this, similar to the lynching of Canoa, no? Where the priest also say, I don't know what happened. I don't know how they rang the church bells. So these are basically my sources. No, I mean, these telegrams and letters, newspapers, and the security reports, and a few cases from the judicial archive. And in total, I analyzed 366 cases of lynching in my book. I, of course, examined many more, like 1,000 cases, but the ones that made it into my, like, that fit my definition of lynching were a total of 366 cases, driven by religion, but also, as I said at the beginning of my talk, by accusations of witchcraft, by crimes, I mean, like robberies, kidnappings, among others, as well as by opposition to the authorities of the central state. So thank you, Nathan.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Eben. The relationship between church and state deteriorated some in the 60s and 70s. I see that change, at least partially, a result of an emergent progressive wing willing to challenge the state for the failure to live up to revolutionary promises. How do you see the persistence of lynching and religious violence fitting into that shift in relationship?
Right. Yes.
And
no, that
congratulates you on your wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. No, that's a very good question. I mean, it's true. I mean, there was yet another change, right? I mean, following this alignment between the state and church alongside anti-communist and nationalist sentiments. Once the church experiences more progressive shift, no, I mean, after Vatican II, I mean, and the liberation theology and the influence that liberation theology has, there is another, you know, like another period or another era in church-state relations, and I think again, like I think this again complicates how, or rather tells us how we need to look beyond church-state relationships in order to understand religious violence. No, I mean, because on the one hand, because as we see in the case of Protestants, even though church-state relations were better, that didn't mean that Catholics stopped believing that using violence was necessary in order to assert their religious freedom or their religion. And on the other hand, because there are so many divisions within the Catholic Church itself, no, that regardless of what the hierarchy is doing, or regardless of these more progressive strands, at the local level, it looked very different. No, I mean, going back to the case of Canoa, I mean, this happened in 1968, which you would believe, you know, like there were already certainly people like students, activists, youth that embrace liberation theology, that embrace these more like progressive ideas within the church. And yet in Puebla in general, and specifically in this town of San Miguel Canoa, the strand of Catholicism that was most powerful was, again, this kind of anti-communistic Catholicism. So I think, I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer, but I think it just pushes us to, again, look beyond church-state relationships on the other hand, and then just recognize the plural voices within Catholicism, no? I mean, and how they were divided. What I would say is that above all, and that connects to the ways in which I theorize lynching in general in my book, is that lynching for the most part was a conservative and defensive form of violence, no? I mean, so for the most part, it was a form of social control. It was about preserving the status quo, no? I mean, it wasn't neither a weapon of the weak nor a form of revolutionary violence. I mean, it was about preserving the established social order, and most often than not, that established social order looked, in the context of Mexico, as Catholic, no, and as defending the communities from the intervention of the central state. But thank you, Evan, for your question.
Thank you, Gema. I have a new set of questions and I wanted to pose them. Ricardo has actually, before going to that, I see a hand up, so I'll go to Ricardo, but, and then I'll come back to myself. Ricardo, go ahead. Did you want to have your hand up?
Yes. Hi,
Okay.
could you guys listen to me? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm with my son right now. So if you hear a lot of screaming and laughing and everything is fine, but just
Gema
wanted to
and
make sure.
I forgot to announce this at the beginning, but Gema and I established a policy of understanding if children are screaming and laughing in the background, because it's just as likely to happen to one of us. So.
Well, that's great. And I appreciate it. And so Gema, like everybody's been saying, this is a fascinating topic and a great talk. So thank you very much. And I've seen you do workshops on this in other venues, and it's really great to see the project and your whole intellectual project evolve and looking at different dimensions of it depending on where we are. And I just wanted to say something to this point about different Catholic groups and approaching Protestantism in different ways and violence, etc. And one thing that I think maybe one day we should talk, because this is really fascinating to me, because I work on the 1930s, and I noticed that even by the late 1930s, even though a group like Catholic Action, for example, started out as being super anti-Protestant in the early 1930s, by 1938, 39, some of these publications, I mean, they're not explicitly pro-Protestant in any way, but they're approaching Catholicism in a very different light, and they're even altering Catholicism in a way that is kind of Protestant, that is kind of emphasizing individual faith, that is emphasizing, more of like the individual search for closeness to God. So even though they have all of this discourse on the outside that is very much antagonistic, within they're realizing, I think, that they have to adapt in some way, ideologically at least, to the influence of Protestantism, especially in the countryside. So I think it's fascinating to me, just from my own perspective, that this is happening at the same time that you're writing about increased violence against Protestants, right? So that kind of third phase in your talk. So I just thought it was really fascinating. I think there's just a whole complex thing happening here. And I think you're very right to point out that it's not just church and state, and even within Catholic groups, there are all these politics and dynamics that are so complex. So anyway, I just wanted to make that observation. But again, just thank you again for such a great talk. And thank you, Julia, also for leading such a great discussion on this.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Thank you, Ricardo. And if I can just say, I mean, yes, definitely. And I have to say, like, Nathan Elstrand works on Sinarquistas, as well as Julia, who's also writing on them. And Ricardo, I know that you are working on the Acción Católica Mexicana, and I'm really interested in listening to or learning more about your work, especially because, again, similarly to the Sinarquistas, which, because I study violence, I encounter their use of violence, right? And it's just my bias, right? Because I'm looking for that, no? And so in the case of Acción Católica, like many of the instances that I analyze in my book, and also like in this new project that I just began, involve members of Acción Católica. And so I do wonder, like kind of like the divisions that exist within this organization. I mean, or again, who claims to be a member of it, no? Who is a legitimate representative of these organizations? And also, like, I should say, like, one of the things that I have begun working on this new project that eventually will be a second book in many years to come, is precisely how what you were mentioning about them reinterpreting or kind of like exercising religion in a more individual way, in which they approach God in a more individual way, and they approach the sources more freely. Like, I have found that also in connection to the ways in which they reinterpret martyrdom, sacrificial violence, and other and the principle of just war, in order to justify their use of violence. No, so again, I guess what I'm saying is that even this kind of like more free way of interpreting religious symbols or Catholic symbols and references might also lean itself or open itself to the use of violence, no? And I accept that as I said before, like, I am biased, no, because that's what I'm looking for. But I am really, really looking forward to our dialogue, because it's definitely an area that needs to be explored further, no, including the Acción Católica and the Sinarquistas too, and the relation to violence.
Well, and if I can say, I mean, the Sinarquistas insist that they're a nonviolent organization. And, you know, I was giving a presentation earlier, I don't know, a year and a half ago, but earlier on in my research, and I was sort of repeating that, like, well, they always said they were a nonviolent organization. And Alberto Garcia Maldonado was there, who works on braceros in the region where the Sinarquistas were. And he was like, excuse me, I have these nonstop reports of Sinarquista violence, and there's violence against Sinarquistas. And like, part of this is the context of, you know, post-revolutionary Mexico. Everybody has a gun still, and for a while there are tendencies towards violence that can't be simply understood by church-state conflicts. But also there is this pattern of organizations saying that publicly that they're very peaceful and, you know, pacifistic, but in practice there's violence that happens. I wanted to ask a question that is for you, but also might be a question for others at this event who might not study Mexico. And what it is, I mean, I think it's a sort of a multi-part question that I think you've already answered parts of. So I think the first part was, does the Mexican church admit that this is a problem? I mean, you've just said hundreds of lynchings over a relatively, I mean, a few decades, but still a relatively short period of time. But I think the sense I got already from what you've said is that no, the Mexican church is sort of not really responding to this in any way. So then I wonder, but you can correct me, but then I wonder, like, is anybody talking about this, especially, sorry, not talking, is anybody justifying this, particularly like giving it a theological justification? I'm thinking of like Jose de Jesus Manriquez y Zárate, who was in the United States for large parts of the Cristero War, sort of like continuously articulating why violence was justified. And I'm just wondering if there were any voices like that, sort of, yeah, like theologizing, if that's the right word, Catholic violence and justifying it. I mean, there's, you know, the whole rhetoric around just war, which wouldn't fit this case, but I just wonder whether there were moralizing, more sort of attempting to frame it in a moral way, or to theologize it. And then the last question, which is really also for others who are here, if they want to chime in, that, you know, are there obvious comparisons to similar events, say in Europe. I can't think of any in the United States, but maybe I could. But yeah, this sort of spontaneous, unorganized but persistent Catholic violence, and maybe that might help answer that question of the justifications for it. So I'll stop with that, and I see a few more things in the chat, but I'll let you respond and sort through what's in the chat.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, so does the Mexican church accept this is a problem? I mean, they address and recognize that these things are happening, but I would say that, I mean, two things. One is that their attitude is to say, especially again in the 1930s and beyond, that they do not embrace violence, or that rather that they do not tolerate the use of violence. No, I mean, and they decry the use of violence, and they say explicitly, especially the higher ranks of the Catholic Church. I mean, they say we do not tolerate the use of violence. I mean, we are embracing civil forms of resistance. No, I mean, like we need to organize ourselves through Catholic action. I mean, through civil engagements in the public sphere. I mean, we need to exercise our rights as citizens within peaceful and organizing on the ground, etc. No, so there is a very strong message that they do not tolerate violence officially. However, on the one hand, especially when it comes to violence against socialist teachers, violence against Protestants, you find this paradox, because on the one hand, they are saying that they do not tolerate the use of violence. On the other hand, they are calling on Catholics to show that they are true Catholics by defending their right to educate their children, defending also the right to even contest or even push against the presence of Protestants and socialist teachers. And so this paradox and this kind of very contradictory discourse, no? On the one hand, no, do not take up arms, no, do not engage in violence. On the other hand, show us that you're a very good Catholic by militantly and adamantly defending religion. I mean, that of course got translated in whichever way people understood it on the ground, no? I mean, and kind of my argument here is that parish priests really play a pivotal role in terms of how this was translated at the local level. I mean, so we need to look at this kind of like not the hierarchy or the higher ranks, but rather like this local parish priests and what they were doing and how they were interpreting through their sermons and through their connection to local communities, these orders from above. On the other hand, recognizing that, again, Catholics had their own agency. No? I mean, so Catholics on the ground, even they would even contest what the parish priest was saying. No? I mean, so even we need to recognize that not necessarily the parish priest had the upper hand. No, I mean, sometimes, like again, Catholics on the ground could say or interpret it the way they wanted. Now, is anyone justifying it? Again, like I think in a discursive level, not necessarily overt violence, but the very but in a way the very active, aggressive defense of religious exercise. Yes, no, I mean, so not openly through violence, but just through calling upon Catholics to be very aggressive in their defense, and then leaving it up for interpretation what that meant on the ground. Now, I also want to hear from others, like if they have like experience or examples of this kind of thing happening in Europe, US, or other contexts. I wanted to say that in the Latin American context, anti-Protestant violence during this period of time, 1940s, 1950s, was also very intense and high in countries like Colombia and Brazil. And there's still like a transnational history to be written about what happened between the Vatican and what these countries were doing at the local level, because this was part of a larger anti-Protestant campaign in the several countries of Latin America. But again, I'm very happy to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, Nathan says, what about religious violence in Central America? I'm not sure, Nathan, which time period you're talking about, but I would imagine that I mean, this whole process of Protestantization of especially Central America and then Southern Mexico and Northern Mexico seems to have happened with a lot of violence. And it's so interesting what you say, Gema, about defensiveness. Like, is this violence justified because in the minds of the people that are doing it, and in the, I can't say the mind of the church, but in the sort of common perception from the hierarchy on down to the parish priest, that, like, you know, the burning of a church, or the destruction of a saint, or an altar, or the desecration of an altar, that is violence against Catholics, right? So well, they're not turning the other cheek, but they're maybe that's almost like the just war. You know, I mean, I know there is a justification for it, but I think your point about the defensiveness is really key. So I don't know if others have comments about that, about religious violence in other places. I keep thinking about there has to be something in medieval Europe, but my two colleagues that are medievalists both had to go a little early today, so they can't answer this. I'll have to bother them about it later. But it just seems like there has to be something, but I can't think of it. But anyway, are there other comments? And feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in. Oh, here's a long one. Okay, so this one is from Albert. Wonderful presentation. It might be a little bit out of the time frame of this presentation, which is totally fine, I think. But I was wondering if in the process of your research, you encountered any precedents or precursors to this role of lynching, religiously motivated or not, in Mexican power dynamics prior to the Cristero War or even the revolution. Do you find any interesting or important instances of lynching during the turmoil of the revolution, or maybe even around the time of the Reform War, that didn't fit into the larger narrative of the book and the presentation? And if so, what do you think about those instances and about those political eras, and how do you see those as fitting into the evolution of these violent tactics over time? Thanks again for the great presentation. And thanks, Albert. That seems like a great question to me.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Albert. Yes, so indeed, like, I think, I mean, the name, I should begin by saying, like, the concept of lynching, or the term lynching, began to be used more clearly in Mexico in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, during the 1870s, more or less, and up till 1930, it was actually spelled with a Y, following the English spelling. So clearly the word linchamiento, no, was spelled with a Y, following its English spelling. So it was clearly adopted in reference to the practice in the United States. And it's not surprising that it kind of became used in Mexico at the time in which lynchings intensified in the United States. No? So there was full awareness in Mexico in terms of the practice in the US. Now, there are several events during the colonial times, during the 19th century, that fit the definition of lynching, but that were not known as lynching. No, I mean, that were more like riots and called with the name of motín in the context of Mexico, or zafarrancho, or other things, and that really fit into the kind of sequencing and the politics that I described for these forms of religious violence. So there is the work of William Taylor, no, about like these colonial riots, and that are described precisely as beginning with the ringing of the church bells, like calling people to summon and attack someone that they perceive as dangerous or intrusive to the local communities. There is, during the 19th century, in the context of the liberal reforms, also, I mean, the one that I have studied a bit more is in the case of Puebla, and this is because before working on the book, which became more of a like national, or trying to tell the story of lynching from a national perspective, the doctoral dissertation which this book is based upon dealt with Puebla. No? I mean, so I know a little bit more for the case of Puebla outside of the period of the book. So I know that in Puebla, in the context of the liberal reforms, I mean, there were riots, no? I mean, but again, many of them looked like lynching because they ended up with the killing, hanging in this very public, collective way of somebody opposing the liberal reforms, no? I mean, opposing the position of these secularizing and anti-clerical policies. So certainly, like these acts of anti-clericalism, these liberal reforms, which preceded the Mexican Revolution, or rather informed the kind of anti-clericalism that will come with the revolution, have prompted similar events or similar incidents in the 19th century, and they did follow a similar sequencing. No, I mean, again, with the tolling of the church bells, the gathering of people. Now, as a historian, like I like to say, well, I mean, things in somehow they have a trajectory, but they do not remain the same. So what I would say is distinct about the period that I examine is that people were justifying and then resisting these anti-clerical measures based on the language of the revolution. No, I mean, so those that were decrying the use of religious violence, they were appealing to the state authorities, saying that or asking them to really uphold the rule of law, but also to deliver the promises of the revolution. No, I mean, so people like victims of lynching, they were including, like, again, Protestant socialist teachers and others. They were asking authorities, defend us. No, I mean, we are the ones that are promoting the agrarian reform. We are the ones that are promoting the revolutionary project. You authorities, you state, have the responsibility to protect our safety, our safetiness. And those that oppose the revolutionary project articulated the discontent also in that language. No, so I think that is distinct of this moment. And but the sequencing, and again, like this kind of anti-religious policies they had earlier on produced these kinds of attacks. And I wanted to go back to what you said, Julia, about the defensiveness, and a little bit about the, you know, like this very I mean, these attacks against religious images. No, I mean, if you look at if you believe in the ways in which people saw the presence of God in these images, no, and I am beginning to kind of like understand more this. So it is not it shouldn't come as a surprise that mutilated saints, mutilated bodies mutilated saints translated into mutilated bodies. No, I mean, this kind of retaliation and this kind of symbolics of marking the bodies was certainly informed by the mutilation of these religious images. And I think the work of this French historian that works on religious riots, Natalie Simon Davis, I mean, talking about Europe, I think it's a great, if anyone, or if you haven't read that, for people that are still with us, I highly recommend that. No, I mean, to understand this, the highly symbolic meanings of violence, and why Catholics took seriously attacks against their religious symbols and artifacts.
Yeah, it's I think that's always that's the challenge, right, of writing about these types of events, is you have to remember what people, that this was the reality for people, that this was their reality. And so there's always a little bit, when I first started writing about this, well, people said they saw the Virgin of Guadalupe in the fields of battle during the Crisiada. No, they didn't say they saw her, right? And so, this was their reality. So anyway, your comment reminded me of that thought. We probably have time for one more question if someone just wants to call one out or type one really quickly. So I'll give another minute to anyone who wants to. And I mean, Gema and I could probably continue talking all night about this. And I still have like new questions that have arisen as our discussion has gone on. One little tiny thing that I'll say is back to that I wanted to say before, but you went to the next point, which was so interesting that I didn't want to interject, was that phrase that maybe others have heard. I think it's a common phrase. I know I've heard it a lot in Mexico. Soy católico, pero no soy fanático, right? Or soy católica, pero no soy fanática. So I have personally heard that. And then when I was doing my own research, I saw that term fanático used to distinguish between different, like católico and católico fanático, used to distinguish between Catholics who were willing to conduct violence, commit violence, versus Catholics who are maybe, you know, well, I'm not, no soy fanático, like I'm not willing to go that far. So anyway, just one other little tiny thought on the ways that Catholics distinguish themselves. Of course, that's a sort of insulting term, and somebody who is Catholic, who identifies as Catholic and would be willing to participate in a lynching would not describe themselves as a fanático, because they would describe themselves as católico. And that argument, by the way, of who's Catholic and who gets to say who's Catholic and who gets to say who's not Catholic, as a faculty member at the Catholic University, I can say with authority that that argument is continuing. So this is an ongoing argument in the Catholic world to this day, I think certainly in the United States and elsewhere. So I want to thank you so much, Gema, for your comments, for your wonderful presentation, your wonderful, clear presentation, and for all the questions that came in and the comments. I will stop recording now.